Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Mapper Forward Friends. Today on the podcast, let's have a bit of a conversation about how the Sydney coffee industry is experiencing COVID, or Sydney in general is experiencing COVID. As you may have guessed if you're keeping up with the news, Australia is COVID-free and has been COVID-free, particularly Sydney, has been COVID-free for quite some time now. And we'll get into why in a little bit, but I've been receiving questions from a lot of people saying, how is the Sydney coffee industry experiencing COVID compared to what it was like in the US? And what is it like to be in a cafe in Sydney compared to the way that most of the rest of the coffee industry is experiencing COVID? So I thought I would let you in on the experiences that I've been having. So let's start at the beginning of the pandemic. How did Sydney experience the pandemic back then? So March 2020, Sydney went, like the rest of Australia, went into full lockdown for a couple of weeks. And from speaking to people here, it was really, really serious. You were not allowed on the streets unless you could prove that you were an essential worker or you were getting groceries. And you had to have like a special form that suggested that you were allowed to be on the streets or in your car. Other than that, you would get a fine if you were seen on the streets, driving in the streets, anything like that. So that meant that all cafes had to, if they were deemed essential, they could stay open, but otherwise all businesses had to close. So I think they got around to saying that, well, I'm pretty sure that they got around to saying that cafes were essential for takeout. So they got to do the whole takeout thing. That got under control pretty quickly. So it was, I think, within 2 months, things were under control. How did they get under control? So the New South Wales government, that's the state that Sydney is in, their leadership got onto it really, really quickly. They isolated everybody, they started contact tracing really quickly, and they moved forward from there. Australia closed its borders to anyone that was not a citizen of Australia or a permanent resident of Australia. And so the way that Australia in general approached getting the pandemic under control was that they closed the state borders, got the cases within states down to zero, and then managed that number by closing the international borders and quarantining everybody. So when I came on the 6th of January, I arrived here on the 6th of January US time. I arrived here and had to stay in quarantine for 14 days and got tested twice for COVID during that time. And that's the case still to this day and is expected to be the case for at least the next 12 months. So unless you can prove you're a citizen or that you're already a permanent resident here, you cannot come into the country. Anytime there's even a few cases, they lock down the area where the cases are. And everybody here seems to be super compliant with wanting to get this under control. Now, another city in Australia that underwent a somewhat more challenging experience, more than somewhat, it was a more challenging experience of the pandemic. It's Melbourne, the other big coffee drinking city in Australia. Melbourne underwent lockdown for a lot longer because their quarantine facilities kept getting cases escaping from quarantine and getting out into the wild. And there's a whole bunch of theories about why that happened and how come it's different here in Sydney. But every time the cases were happening, the Premier, which is like the governor, the Premier would lock down the state, or particularly the city of Melbourne. And that went rolling for months. The coffee industry there experienced the pandemic very different to the coffee industry here in Sydney. So where is it at now? What is it like to go into a cafe in Sydney now? Well, when you go to pretty much any business, you'll notice that contact tracing is pretty much it's the big thing that the state is using to keep the pandemic under control. So you go into a cafe and they'll have a QR code, and you must scan the QR code and register that you visited that business. You scan the QR code, and if you don't have the app that logs you into being at that place, you can just go in and fill in a web form, and the venue has to make sure that everybody who sits in their venue or visits their venue registers that they attended through the QR code. It's a part of the conditions of being in business. Now, that's the case for cafes, restaurants, supermarkets, everything. Wherever you are, you must scan the QR code to show that you've been there. And that way, if there is an outbreak, they can contact you via text and say that, listen, there was somebody who has been exposed to COVID or tested positive for COVID that visited a venue that you have been at on this date. So you will, watch out for symptoms, and you're required to quarantine. So that's how they're keeping things under control. When there is an outbreak, they're able to get on top of it a lot quicker. Also, what's happened, since we don't have any reported cases for over a month now here in Sydney, baristas and anybody who works in a cafe no longer has to wear a face mask. Previously, up until last Friday, so up until about 4 days ago, they did have to wear face masks, but they recently just said anyone who works inside a cafe or a restaurant no longer has to wear face masks. So you don't have to wear a face mask anywhere other than public transport in Sydney, which is pretty remarkable. You can wear one if you want to, but they don't require it anymore. Melbourne is a different story, and other parts of Sydney other parts of Australia have a variant of that story. Melbourne's got it the toughest right now of all the cities in Australia. But here in Sydney, cafes are bustling. If you go into a cafe, you'll see that they are observing the social distancing requirements. So they make sure that the tables are spaced out, but they're all full. The cafes are full. I went and visited a couple of cafes on Sunday, and it was normal Sunday trade pre-pandemic. There was 40, 50 people standing outside waiting for to-go coffees or to-go beverages at pretty much every cafe I walked past. Pretty crazy. Look, living in Sydney right now is kind of a mind warp for me. It feels like it's 2019. Everything's pretty much business as usual unless you're on public transport. So how has the pandemic, because it has, how has the pandemic affected the coffee industry? Well, when the pandemic happened, the CBD area, or the downtown area in Sydney, was the most affected. Why? Well, that's where most of the workforce is concentrated. All the central business districts, or the downtown districts in the little cities within Sydney, as well as downtown Sydney, they all kind of shut down and sent their workers to work from home. They were the places where all the busiest cafes were. And when I say busy, we're talking about 150 to 200 kilos, which is double that in pounds, per week of coffee for espresso-based drinks. Now, what that means is that those cafes mostly closed down, and they are starting to very slowly come back. The local government is trying to get people to bring their employees back to the office. However, what you saw was a shift in cafes being visited primarily from the central business districts to now local suburban cafes became super busy. So where some of those cafes were perhaps struggling before, now they were doing incredible business. And you saw a shift in success based on where you were located. Similarly, you've seen property prices and rental prices shift both commercially and residentially based on geography as well. So suburban cafes have done extremely well throughout the pandemic, provided they were able to adapt to the requirements of what people needed. So they pivoted to be grocery stores as well as local cafes, meal prep, etc., etc. City cafes are starting to pick up again as people venture into the city. But one thing that won't pick up for quite some time is the tourism trade, as well as students are not allowed back in to the country. So that's not going to be something where cafes around universities and around usually densely populated areas because of student housing is not going to happen. We get a lot of students from China and other parts of Asia. And the other thing is we will not be getting a lot of business people coming to the country because our borders are closed, especially the city. Sydney's a well-visited city for exhibitions as well as, business trade. We get a lot of business people from China come here to do a lot of deals. It's a city that people love to come to, and all of that has stopped. And so because of that, as well as the tourism trade stopping, you are seeing Sydney cafes in the central business district, downtown area, not doing well at all. And a lot of them have closed and closed for good. But the suburban cafes are doing really, really well. Again, indoor seating, outdoor seating, no masks. All you've got to do is check in with your QR code and you're fine. It has been mind-bending being back in Sydney. Having experienced what I experienced in the US and coming back here and being able to walk around freely whenever I want, and to walk into a business and not have to put a mask on and not have to walk around worried about pretty much anything is doing my head in the best way possible. And it is taking an extraordinary amount of adjustment time. But this is we have only 24 million people in the whole country, and we're an island. Even though the landmass is 3/4 the size of the US, it is much more manageable here than it is in a country like the US. So to answer all your questions, I hope that that's covered it all. My heart goes out to the coffee industry in Melbourne. They are hurting right now because of the open and closing of their city and of their cafes. I hope that changes soon, and I hope everything gets under control much quicker than not. So I hope you found this helpful. Let us know if you have any further questions. Happy to answer them. Peace, love, and peanut butter, friends. Have an amazing rest of your day.